Hi, this is Joe Green, head pastor of St. Paul's Missionary Baptist Church located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, also the founder of the 2019 movement, and I want to share a couple of thoughts with you. Before I get started, I want to set a couple of foundational topics before I get started. What I'm about to say is not a political topic. It's not political, even though some people have politicized what I'm going to talk about. Let's say that again. This is not a political talk. However, many people have politicized what I'm about to talk about. Now, for the record, I'm political. I was a Democrat, registered Democrat from 1985 to 2012. I'm independent now, and I look to just seek out truth and relay truth. I want to stand on principles, and that's the only thing that sustains us as individuals and as a community. Our principles, and instead of principles, what the powers that be have caused us, especially African Americans, is we become enamored by personalities, by political parties, and identity politics. And identity politics in particular has severely crippled and weakened the African American community. A lot of people don't understand what politics is. They don't understand what government is. So let me give you just a quick definition of what politics is. Politics comes from the Greek word politica, which means the affairs of the cities. It means it's a set of activities that are associated with making decisions in groups or other forms of power relations between individuals. Basically, politics is the art of governing over people. That's what politics is. And so when we look at the political spirit, especially as many people say, or what is occurring in American politics, we need to really understand some of the underlying themes behind it in order to properly discern and to interpret the actions that are occurring. One of the things that the power structure does is what's called the Hegelian dialectic. And what the Hegelian dialectic is, it was developed by Robert Hegel in Germany. And I think his name is Robert Hegel in Germany. But anyway, it's about how do you move the public? How do you shape public opinion? And you shape public opinion by controlling both sides of the argument. And you provide a preconceived notion, a predetermined solution for the masses, right? Another way of looking at that is that you cause a crisis, and then you offer the solution, but you already had the solution in the first place. And so that's what happens a lot, that in our political system, we have a lot of people that are on both sides of the aisle, but actually they work for the same team. But in order to sway public opinion in a certain way, they control the narrative on both sides, but they act like they're in opposition to each other. But unfortunately, African Americans, we have bought into identity politics. We have identified with one particular political party and ideology. Well, I should say we identify with a political party. And because we identify with a political party, we now have adopted their ideology, even though their ideology was originally contrary to our principles, right? So you have to stand for principles. You can't stand for personalities. You shouldn't stand for political parties. You shouldn't be participating in identity politics at the sake of principles. You got to stand on principles. As a pastor, the Bible is about biblical principles. And when we stand on biblical principles, regardless of who it is that we're not for or against anybody, but when we stand on these principles, we have success as a community. Now, I'm going to break down a brief history of Black people in the political system in America. It's important to understand so we can understand how we got to where we are. Now, most of you know that slavery, especially was known as chattel slavery, was inherited by the United States government. What do I mean by that? The first slaves arrived in the British colonies of North America, which ultimately became the United States of America, on August the 25th, 1619. So August the 25th, 1619, you had the first 20 and odd Negroes, as history reports, landed on Port Comfort, Virginia, in Hampton, right? It's Hampton, Virginia, landed. That was the start of what became the transatlantic slave trade, which ultimately became chattel slavery. Now the difference is chattel slavery, it wasn't chattel slavery at first. Chattel just means that slaves became property instead of being viewed as human beings. So originally, slavery was based on indentured servitude. Indentured servitude means you came over here, you were a servant for a certain amount of time, 5 to 7 years, and then you were able to get your freedom. But a transition happened, and then it went from indentured servitude to chattel slavery, and the primary focus were people from the continent of Africa and their children. They became personal property. It was a perpetual slavery that they didn't have any rights. And that happened, I believe it was around the 1680s, I believe, and that's when it became official. But in any event, you had slavery. The United States didn't become officially a government, United States, until July 4th, 1776, right? So from 1619 to 1776, slavery was legal on this continent, even though there was no such thing as the United States of America, right? Virginia was the first colony, and Virginia represented the United States before there was any United States, right? So now you have other states that came. You have the formation of the United States in 1776. So United States inherited slavery. It was legal even before the formation of the country. But to its credit, the United States from 1776, 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves at the end of the Civil War, right? So you had this happen. So chattel slavery became illegal in the United States, except for the 13th Amendment outlined that involuntary servitude was illegal in the United States, except for if you committed a crime. And so what happened was they began to use the criminal justice system, mass incarceration, as a form of slavery. So in the South, especially, the Democrats of the South, what they did was they used the prison system to help rebuild the South. And so what they would do is they would go arbitrarily lock up African-American males. They would put them on the chain gangs, and they used them to help to rebuild the South. There was also another thing called convict leasing. So a lot of these incarcerated African-American males were actually leased out to companies and to the private sector, whether it was agriculture, mining, or something along those lines. They were leased out for these private industries, right? So now you have it was called the Negro Codes, and then you had the Jim Crow laws of the South as well. They were segregatory laws. But an interesting thing happened, of course, after slavery was abolished. Going back a little bit, after slavery was abolished and Black people were emancipated, they were given the right to vote. So once they were given the right to vote, they exercised the right to vote. Now, just for the record, you have to realize that the Democrat Party was the pro-slavery party. The Republican Party was created specifically as the anti-slavery party. The formation of the Republican Party was based on anti-slavery. They fought slavery. The abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, all of them were Republicans. And so in the South, when they had these freed slaves, you had a presidential election. Ulysses S. Grant ran for president. Ulysses S. Grant won by 300,000 votes. This was during the time of the Reconstruction. African-Americans, males, had the right to vote. 500,000 African-American males voted for Ulysses S. Grant, who was the Republican candidate. So what happened was the Democrats realized at that point in time that Black people were going to represent the swing vote. Because before that, you had the country almost split down the middle, Democrats versus Republicans. Black people now have the right to vote. They now represent the swing vote. So one of the first things that happened is the Democrats of the South began to put obstacles and barriers. They called it voter suppression. They began putting obstacles and barriers in the way to keep Black people from being able to vote. And so they did things like they did literacy tests. And, during the time of slavery, it was illegal for Black people to teach a slave to vote, to read. So they couldn't read, they were illiterate. So they gave them literacy tests, of course, as an obstacle to keep them from being able to vote. Property ownership or large fees in order to get the right to vote. They put all these obstacles in place to keep Black people from voting. So and so that happened after slavery during the time of Reconstruction. And then, of course, in the 20th century, you had a lot of Black people that were really fighting for the opportunity for the right to be able to vote. And so now you have fast forward, and I'm giving you a Cliff Notes version of it. I'm really summarizing a lot, but I need to get to where I need to get to for us to understand the larger picture. And so during the 20th century, the beginning of 20th century to the middle of the 20th century, you had a big push of many African Americans to get the right to vote. So then in the 1960s, of course, you had the civil rights movement, where Black people were really fighting for equal rights, equal protections under the law. So again, as I said in the beginning, now I'm giving you everything from a historical, factual basis. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. I'm independent. I want to stand on principles. My job is to search out truth and relay it from a true historical standpoint. So what happens is during the time of the civil rights movement and you still had, for the most part, what they call the Southern Dixiecrats, right? So the Democrats were really still pushing in the South, especially against Black people having full rights. Now, Lyndon Baines Johnson is someone who you may have heard of. Lyndon Baines Johnson was from Texas. He was a Southern Dixiecrat, and he was very racist. He fought against the civil rights movement. Now, he fought against the civil rights movement. He was the vice president under John F. Kennedy. There was a switch that occurred, not really a major switch, a minor switch during the time of JFK. And I've talked to people from the King family, Dr. Alveda King, who's a friend of mine, personal friend of mine, the niece of Martin Luther King. She told me the story when Kennedy and Nixon were running against each other. Kennedy was the Democrat candidate, and Nixon, of course, Republican. So MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., was incarcerated in Alabama in the Selma prison. So his father, MLK Jr.'s father, went to the Kennedy campaign and the Nixon campaign and asked both of them, pleaded with both of them to intervene so that his son didn't get killed while he was in prison. You guys may be familiar in the South that a lot of Black people, especially African-American males, would disappear or get lynched or something like that. Even sometimes in the South, they would trump up crimes. They would just come up with crimes and to incarcerate them or even to lynch them many times. So the Nixon campaign was silent. They didn't want to get involved with it. It was too much of a hotbed issue during the time of the election and was a closely contested race. So Kennedy, JFK, wrote a letter to the governor of Alabama at the time. I think it was Governor George Wallace, if I'm remembering correctly, and asked him to make sure that Martin Luther King Jr. was safe in prison. And so because of that, MLK's father supported Kennedy. And so because of that, it gave the impression to many African Americans that that now the Democrat Party has become the Civil Rights Party, right? That was the impression they had. So now we know JFK gets assassinated. You have LBJ, who was a Southern Dixiecrat, racist Democrat. Now all of a sudden he supports the civil rights legislation of 1964. Now LBJ, if you didn't know, was a socialist. Also, FDR was a socialist. Now, to put things in perspective as we move forward, I need you to understand, and I've been doing a lot of talks on it, but I think sometimes what happens with people is they don't want to attribute evil or negative intentions to people, right? They don't want to believe that people are inherently evil. And so let me kind of preface what I'm saying now is when I'm talking about socialism, when I'm talking about some of the things I'm talking about, I'm not necessarily attributing evil intentions to all the people involved. That's not what I'm doing. But what you have to understand is that socialism, the foundation of socialism and globalism, is about power and control. And so, communism is the ultimate goal of socialism. The globalist form of government that they want is communism, where people don't own any personal property. Everything is controlled by the state, and people are just willingly participants in the state, right? The state represents the government. But you have to understand something. There's a famous saying that power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the more people, human beings, gain power, the more corrupt they become. especially when you're talking about power and money. And so politics really has a lot of money and financial benefit involved, and that's intentional by the globalists, right? So anyway, socialism's ultimate goal is for control, right? There's people, power structures that want to control the people, control the masses. They want to control the transference of wealth. They want to control the means of production for the nation, because they know if they control the means of production and they have the authority over the transference of wealth, then they have ultimate power over the people, right? And so absolute power corrupts, and power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so ultimately the socialists wanted simply to gain and to maintain political power. Okay, now let's go back to LBJ. LBJ formerly had opposed the civil rights legislation, right, which gives voting protection, right, protection for people to be able to vote. Up until that point, from the time of the Reconstruction all the way up to now, to the civil rights, you had a lot of obstacles that were placed in front of Black people so that they weren't able to vote, right? So now you have LBJ that does a switch. He does a 180-degree turn, and he begins to support the civil rights legislation. LBJ, for those of you who don't know, was a socialist, right? He had socialist underpinnings in his ideology. And so he came up with this idea called the Great Society. The Great Society, just like FDR had the New Deal, you have the Great Society, which has a strong socialist undertones, right? So LBJ, they questioned him. It was reported by an unauthorized biographer of LBJ. And I've read reports, and many people that was around LBJ, they all attested to the fact that he was racist. He used the N-word frequently. I have a recording, actually, of one of his phone calls that was taped in the White House where he's throwing the N-word around, right? So it was no question that he was racist. There's no question that he used the N-word regularly. This is all documented. People around him acknowledge that LBJ did that. So anyway, there's a report from an authorized biographer of LBJ that he was doing a speech in Kentucky in the mountains, and some of his constituents were confused as to why he all of a sudden switched and began to support the civil rights bill, the civil rights legislation. And so his response was, because of the Voting Rights Act and Black people now started to once again get the right to vote and have a certain amount of political power, he says, and I'm paraphrasing, he says that Negroes are becoming uppity, is what he called them. He says, but for the first time, they have something to go along with their uppityness, and that's political power, the right to vote. He said, so we have to give them something, not enough to make a difference, but enough to gain their loyalty, and we'll have them voting, and he used the N-word, we'll have Black people voting Democrat for the next 200 years. Because what LBJ did was he came up with this strategy, this idea called the war on poverty. And since the 1960s, the United States government has spent $22 trillion to fight what they call the war on poverty. But because of LBJ's socialistic undertones, he didn't create the war on poverty and the welfare system as a way to empower the people, but to gain political loyalty to their party. That's how identity politics in regards to Black people being so loyal to the Democratic Party on a federal level really came to be. Now, let me reiterate some things that I said earlier so people don't misconstrue where I'm going or what I'm saying. From the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, the Democrat and Republicans that were fighting recognized they were equal. Pretty much the country was split. They start to recognize that people of color, African Americans, represented the swing vote. And so just like during the time of JFK versus Nixon, Black people threw their support behind Kennedy. Kennedy wins the election, right? Just like Ulysses S. Grant, he runs for president right after the Emancipation Proclamation. He runs for president. He wins by 300,000 votes. 500,000 African American males voted for him because women didn't have the right to vote back then. So they recognized that if the African American males hadn't voted for Ulysses S. Grant, he wouldn't have became the president, right? So now with this idea in hand, again, people that are seeking after power, people that have socialistic ideologies now create what's known as the war on poverty as a way to gain political loyalty, even at the sake of destroying the community, right? Because what socialists do, like I said, the people that frame socialism and communism, they weren't coming up with forms of government to empower the people. They were coming up with forms of government that would cause the people to be loyal to them and be actually dependent on the government. Because if you're dependent on a governmental system, whatever institution you are dependent upon, you obviously gain loyalty to, right? Whoever helps to take care of your food and your shelter, you gain loyalty. I mean, they gain your loyalty. And so they understood that. And so that's why they set up the system, not to empower the community, but to gain political loyalty. Now, a lot of people may say, well, yeah, maybe that sounds good, but I don't know. So LBJ, there's a person by the name of Patrick Moynihan, and I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about him just to bring these things in context. See, I like to give historical basis. I've learned over time, because I'm a researcher, and I try to give a lot of facts and a lot of information, not only to back up what I'm saying, but to also give you the opportunity to check my sources. Because if I tell you something that you've never heard or you disagreed with, I would like to have intelligent conversations with people based on facts. So if I provide you with facts and research and data, and you want to rebut what I'm saying, then you have to have your own set of facts or data, right? But that's not what happens, which really proves to me that identity politics is so powerful and so prevalent that many people argue their political position not based on facts and data or history or information, but based on their emotions and their feelings, right? We never solve anything or come to any real logical conclusions if we never do it based on facts and logic and history and all that other stuff. So anyway, I want to talk a little bit about Patrick Moynihan. If you haven't heard of him, in late 1964, Patrick, or his name is Daniel Patrick Moynihan, was largely unknown. He was a 37-year-old assistant secretary of labor in the administration of Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was a liberal Democrat who had been an aide to Governor Averell Harriman of New York in the 1950s. Moynihan enthusiastically supported JFK, a fellow Irish Catholic. In 1960, with the help of friends, he landed a low-level position in the Labor Department in 1961. So he was very much interconnected to the Democratic Party, and more specifically in the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration. Though Moynihan helped develop LBJ's War on Poverty in 1964 and chaired the enactment of the historic Civil Rights Act, also in 1964, he thought that much more had to be done to help Black Americans attain anything resembling socioeconomic equality with whites. As he put it in a memo in the Willard Wirtz, then Secretary of Labor in 1864, the Negroes are asking for unequal treatment. More seriously, it may be that without unequal treatment, there is no way for them to achieve anything like equal status in the long run. With this idea in mind, one that deemed to prefigure what is later called affirmative action, he decided in December of 1964 to write a report about low-income Black family life in the United States. So he wrote this report. He submitted it to LBJ, that talked about the long-term effects of the war on poverty as they had set it up. Now, many of you may or may not know, but how the welfare system was originally set up, as I said, it was based on this socialistic ideology that was supposed to keep people dependent on and loyal to the political system. That's why well, and again, let me say this before I go any further. This is not a knock on anybody on welfare. This is not a knock on single mothers. It's not a knock on anything like that. What I'm doing is giving you a historical basis for what I'm saying in order for us to start to come up with solutions and how to repair our community. And the reason this has really been heavy on my heart, has been heavy on my heart for years when I started the 2019 movement, because I saw the conditions in many of the urban areas as African-American people. But when we see things like these riots that are occurring in Minneapolis as a result of police brutality in our neighborhoods, when we look at many of the larger urban areas where Black people are, you have similar things that occurs. In most Democratic liberal cities in America, larger cities that's run by the Democrats, if you go to the Black section, You have large amounts of poverty, single families, police interaction, incarceration, failing school systems. You see a similar pattern in cities all over the country. And I could run them off, right? These cities: Minneapolis, Democrat mayor. You have Detroit, Michigan; Chicago, Illinois; St. Louis, Missouri; Baltimore, Maryland. And I could go on and on. Houston, Texas; Miami; Los Angeles. These are cities that have been traditionally run by Democrats for decades. And the plight in African-American communities there, largely African-American communities, are very similar, right? You have a lot of drugs, a lot of crime. You have a lot of single mothers raising children. You have failing school systems. You have a lot of poverty. You have all these things and a high level of governmental dependency, right? That is the pattern in most of these cities. And what I'm saying to you is that that's not by chance. There are principles that we can look at that can help break that cycle. So going back to Moynihan helped develop the war on poverty. He's talking about, he did this report on low-income Black families in the United States. Moynihan aimed his in-house report at Johnson administration officials, not at the general public. The document did not divulge his name. Its title page carried the words "for official use only." So he did this anonymous report. He turned it into the Johnson administration. He didn't give it out to the public. It was given to the Johnson administration, and it says "for official use only." But he was a well-read he was a well-read man, had cultivated useful friendships in D.C. In distributing his report, he fired off urgent memorandums to recipients. One such message, directed to LBJ, argued equal opportunity for Negroes as promised of war on poverty. The 1964 Civil Rights Act does not produce equal results because the Negroes today are grievously injured people who, in fair and equal competition, will and large lose out. He reminded Johnson, you were born poor, you were brought up poor, yet you came of age full of ambition, energy, and ability because your father and mother gave it to you. The richest inheritance any child can have is a stable, loving, disciplined family life. Though he pointed out that some Negroes were managing to move into the middle class, he focused on documenting what he argued was the deteriorating situation of impoverished Black families in inner cities. This is back in the 1960s. He filed this report in 1964, or he did this report in 1964. Though he pointed out that some Negroes were managing to move into the middle class, he talks about the deteriorating situation of impoverished Black families in the inner cities. The family structure of lower class Negroes is highly unstable and in many urban centers is approaching complete breakdown. This was a fundamental source of the weakness of the Negro community at the present time. Incredible mistreatment over the past 3 centuries, Moynihan continued, had forced Negro families in the United States into a matriarchal structure. That means the mother, a lack of fathers. This was not necessarily a bad thing, he added, but because such a structure was so out of line with the rest of American society, it seriously retards the progress of the group as a whole and imposes a crushing burden on Negro male and in consequence on a great many Negro women as well. American society presumes male leadership in private and public affairs, a subculture such that of the Negro American in which there is not the pattern is placed at a distinct disadvantage. So that he recognized and gave this report to LBJ, who was the president at the time. And he says, when you have weakened family structures and the family structure of the Negro urban community is deteriorating quickly, it will keep Black people at a disadvantage. And that was 50 plus years ago. So think about this. He gives this report to LBJ with the war on poverty and the Democratic Party, which now most of you have to acknowledge is really the party of socialism. They are pushing the socialism agenda. And because of this, it is no coincidence that when we see these cities that we're talking about, when we see the breakdown of our communities, that there is a weakened family structure. There's a high number of unwed pregnancies. In Baltimore with the Freddie Gray incident, when Freddie Gray died in the back of the paddy wagon, right? There was riots in Baltimore at the time of the Freddie Gray incident. They said that only 16% of African-American teens lived in a household with both mother and father, right? Moynihan, it says a consequence of these trends, Moynihan emphasized, was a startling increase in welfare dependency among American Negroes, largely because of broken families. in considerable part to wonderful cultural trends, which have featured ever more consistent popular demands for personal freedom, marriage rates since the 1960s have tumbled, and percentages of births that are out of wedlock have escalated through much of the economically developed Western world. Among non-Hispanic African Americans, this percentage jumped from 23.6% in 1963. So in 1963, the unwed pregnancy rate in the African American community was 23.6%. To more than 70%, and has stayed over 70% since the mid 1990s. So overall, 41% of births today in the United States are out of wedlock, but over 70%, and I've heard estimates from anywhere between 72 and 74% in the African American community, unwed births. So what am I saying? I'm saying that understanding that the true destructive pattern in the community is a breakdown and weakened family structure. So we, not just African Americans, but I'm talking specifically to that particular issue, our focus can't continually be more social programs. It has to be more programs that help strengthen families. For those of you who may or may not know, if a single mother is on welfare, if she gets married, she immediately loses her welfare benefits. And so many couples stay single. I don't know if it's still the case, but I know when I was growing up, and even before that, if a woman was on public assistance, at times the county or whoever it was that she was receiving the benefits from would come to her house. And if the man lived there, she would lose her benefits. Even when you think about child support. So the child support system is that if a man is behind on his child support, he can be incarcerated and they will still garnish his wages. So ultimately what happens is the state still becomes the provider for the family. Now, I want you to hear me now. I'm saying this not based on emotions and not based on pointing the finger at anyone or making anyone feel bad, but we have to have open and honest conversations in order to come to real solutions, right? We have been in a perpetual cycle over the last few decades of a deteriorating family structure, which ultimately trickles down to large portions of our community. Now, I'm not saying that everybody, there's people that and of course, people in the African American community that have and do excel. There's single mothers who have done a great job and they've broken the cycle of poverty. But statistically speaking, when you have weakened family structures, the rest of society suffers. So stronger families create stronger individuals, right? Less dependency on the government, because when we have governmental dependency, one thing that the government can never do is raise families. Right? They can't break the cycle of poverty. They don't break the cycle of dysfunction and weakened families. The family structure has to do that. Now, ultimately, Christians should be doing that. Churches are supposed to be the cornerstone of the community. And when the church is the cornerstone of the community and helping to strengthen families, they help to break the cycle of poverty. They help to break the cycle of broken families. They help to break the cycle when we're doing what we're supposed to do, because churches are supposed to be family centers, right? Churches are supposed to help single mothers raise their children. Churches are supposed to help to strengthen, right? To create businesses, create all these type of things. Now, let me say this, and this is a couple other things. Again, this is not a political speech, even though people have politicized the things that I'm talking about. You know, everything I'm saying is based on biblical principles, right? So it's not a mystery, but I don't have to preach a sermon by giving you chapter and verse, but these principles work, period. So think about when they created even, whether it's the welfare system, when they created the, where the, before that, the Bible talked about, God told the church to look out for the widows and the orphans. Now, think about it this way. When the church looks out for the widows and the orphans, we help to strengthen families. We help to break the cycle of poverty. We help to change the mindset of the people. When the government does it, it perpetuates the cycle because it makes the people dependent on the state instead of dependent on the family structure, right? And so we're in a very critical time. And again, I want to say this, that, you know, racism, poverty, and those type of things are very real in many of our communities, but ultimately it's the breakdown of the family and the lack of a biblical foundation for many of our families that perpetuate what we see going on in America, right? The disenfranchisement in a lot of our communities. You know, we have to get back to, we should be getting back to business, having small business ownership. You know, I had a conversation of a person recently about the about minimum wage. Minimum wage is not the answer. Raising minimum wage is not the answer. If you look at a macroeconomic level of things, raising the minimum wage actually raises the cost of living in the community where that minimum wage is raised. So what do I mean by that? For instance, I think if minimum wage is $10 and you raise it to $15 for a business owner, it doesn't bring in more revenue. It actually reduces your profitability. And so when you have to pay more for goods and services, then that means either your profit margin decreases or you're going to have to raise the price of goods and services, or you're going to have to hire less people, one or the other, right? And so the solution isn't to raise the minimum wage, because the minimum wage was never meant to for a person, a man who's making minimum wage. It was never set up for him to be able to provide for his family on minimum wage, right? What the backbone of America and any community is small business ownership, entrepreneurship, because an entrepreneur to a certain degree can actually write his own paycheck, right? The more your business grows and prospers, the more money you can bring in. You're not bound to minimum wage, but you have the opportunity to make a larger, a better living, right? Education, higher education. All studies show that when you have a breakdown of the family, a weakened family structure, especially when you have fatherless homes, that overall the children have lower academic performance, right? Higher mental illness rates when you have broken families and fatherless homes. And studies from the Department of Corrections, the American Educational Society, or whatever it's called, the American Educational Foundation, many major universities all have done studies that prove that when you have weakened family structures, there's so many other negative effects that happen. And I would say to you that having a bunch of negative police interactions also contribute to that, because when you have strong males in the household and in the community, it polices itself. So when I grew up, when we were acting up, whether it's someone in my household or someone in the neighborhood, there was a lot of men, whether it's my baseball coaches, basketball coaches, football coaches, whether it's my friend's dad or the man who lives across the street, they help police our community, which reduce criminal activity, it reduce gang activity and all that other stuff. And ultimately, there's less police interaction when you have strong family units and you have males in the community that helps to police their own community. And so I'm going to leave it at that, but I just wanted to share that with you. We want to offer solutions, right? We want to restore family values and family structures. We want to see how we can really help our community and build our community back up, because the last thing I want to do is see more George Floyds or Mike Browns or Trayvon Martins or Eric Garners on the news over and over again showing a Black man dying at the hands of someone from outside of the community, especially a police officer. This has been Joe Green, head pastor of St. Paul's Missionary Baptist Church, also the founder of the 2019 movement. Until next time, peace and blessings to you. Shalom, shalom, shalom.